Ever catch yourself wondering if your thoughts are kind of, I don't know, more powerful than we realize?
What? Like we could influence the lottery numbers if we just thought about it hard enough?
Ha ha ha. Well, maybe not quite like that. But what if we could influence something random, like a coin flip?
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
So today, we're diving into this paper, get this, declassified from the CIA reading room.
Okay, now you've got my attention. CIA, huh?
Right. It's from 1989, called Evidence for Consciousness-Related Anomalies in Random Physical Systems. And full disclosure, it gets a little out there.
Sounds like my kind of paper. Anomalies in random systems. Lay it on me.
So these researchers, they were looking at something called random number generators, RNGs. They're like digital coin flips. Supposed to be totally random.
Right. I'm familiar with RNGs. So they were trying to see if people could, control the outcome with their minds.
You got it. And they didn't just do one or two experiments. They reviewed hundreds of studies on this using a technique called meta-analysis.
Meta-analysis, that's like taking a bunch of smaller studies and combining them to get a bigger picture. It's a powerful tool.
Exactly. So you can imagine hundreds of studies on people trying to influence RNGs, all those results put together.
So what'd they find? Did it work? Were people actually influencing these random numbers?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And the researchers, they knew they were dealing with a controversial topic. One of the big things they had to account for is something called the file drawer problem. Have you heard of that?
Oh yeah, the file drawer problem, definitely. It's the idea that studies that show a positive result, something interesting or groundbreaking, are more likely to get published, while studies with negative or inconclusive results just end up, hidden away in a file drawer somewhere.
Exactly. So how do you account for all those potentially hidden studies when you're trying to get a clear picture from a meta-analysis?
Right, it's a valid concern. So how did these researchers address it?
Well, they actually used some fancy statistical modeling to try and estimate how many unpublished studies with null results would have to exist to actually negate their findings.
Wow, so they really tried to cover their bases, but even with that, did the effect still hold up?
That's what's wild. Even after accounting for the file drawer, there was still something there. But they didn't stop there. They took it a step further.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What else did they do?
Well, they started looking at the quality of all the studies they were including in their meta-analysis because, let's be real, not all studies are created equal.
Absolutely. You've got your well-designed, rigorously controlled studies, and then you've got your, shall we say, less than perfect ones.
Exactly. So they actually developed a whole set of criteria to assess the quality of each study, looking at things like, were the experiments properly blinded? Were there any potential sources of bias? How was the data collected and analyzed? Stuff like that.
Smart. They wanted to make sure they weren't just cherry-picking studies that supported their hypothesis, right?
Exactly. They wanted to see if the effect of consciousness on the RNGs held up, even when you only looked at the cream of the crop, the most well-designed experiments.
Okay, now you've got me on the edge of my seat. So what happened? Did it hold up?
Well, that's what we'll get into next. So they went through all this trouble, grading hundreds of studies, trying to account for all the things that could skew the results.
Yeah, they really went above and beyond to make sure their analysis was solid.
Exactly. So what happened? What did they find when they focused on those top-tier, rigorously designed studies?
Well, here's the kicker. The effect was still there.
Get out! You're kidding? Even with the best of the best studies.
Even with the best of the best. In fact, the effect was even stronger in those studies.
Whoa! Okay, now that's just wild. So the more carefully they controlled the experiment, the more likely they were to find that people were influencing the random number generators.
That's what the data suggests, yeah.
I gotta be honest, part of me still wonders if there's any other explanation for this. Like, could there be something else going on here that we're just not seeing?
It's always good to be a bit of a skeptic, right? Especially with something as mind-boggling as this. One possibility that comes to mind is, what if the random number generators themselves weren't actually as random as everyone thought?
So maybe there were subtle patterns in the RNGs that the researchers just weren't picking up on.
Exactly. Like imagine you're flipping a coin that's slightly weighted. You might think the results are random, but there's actually a bias towards heads or tails.
Oh, I see. So maybe those hidden patterns in the RNGs were showing up as a false positive for the consciousness effect.
It's a possibility. And it's not just the technology we need to think about, but the human element too, right? There's something called the experimenter effect that we always have to consider in these kinds of studies.
The experimenter effect. I'm not familiar with that one.
So it's this idea that even subconsciously, researchers can influence the outcome of an experiment just through their own expectations or biases.
Oh, interesting. So like, if the researcher really believes in their hypothesis, they might unconsciously act in ways that nudge the results in that direction.
Subtly. Yeah, without even realizing it. Like maybe they give off subtle cues when they're interacting with the participants, or they interpret the data in a way that favors their desired outcome.
That's fascinating and a little unnerving to think that our own beliefs can shape reality in such a tangible way. So even with the best intentions, it's really tough to completely eliminate bias from an experiment.
Absolutely. It's something we always have to be aware of and try to control for as much as possible. But for a moment, let's just put aside the skepticism and the what ifs. Let's just imagine, just for fun, that this research is onto something real. That consciousness really does have the power to influence random systems in a way we don't yet understand. What would that mean?
Yeah, where do we even begin to wrap our heads around that? That's some serious next level stuff.
It is, right. If this is true, it kind of throws a wrench into our current understanding of, well, reality itself. Like, it challenges this idea that consciousness is just a byproduct of the brain. Instead, it might be this force that can interact with and influence the physical world in ways we're only just beginning to glimpse.
Okay, now that's getting into some serious science fiction
That's
territory.
your
Like,
type.
are we talking telekinesis? Mind control?
Uh-huh. Well, we might be getting ahead of ourselves a little there, but it's definitely a tantalizing thought, and it raises a whole bunch of new questions. If consciousness can influence random systems, what are the limits of that influence? Does it extend beyond the digital world into the physical world? Could we, like, heal ourselves with our minds or influence events in our lives?
Okay, now my mind is officially blown. On the one hand, you have this really rigorous scientific analysis suggesting there might be something to this idea. But on the other hand, it opens up this whole Pandora's box of possibilities that seem, well, impossible.
And that's what's so exciting about this kind of research, right? It pushes the boundaries of what we think is possible and forces us to confront some of the biggest mysteries of the universe.
It's like we've stumbled into this, I don't know, hidden corner of science where the impossible suddenly seems, well, not so impossible anymore.
And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, right? It's like, where do we even go from here? If we entertain the possibility that this is real, that consciousness can influence random systems, what's the next step?
Right? It's not enough to just observe it. We need to understand it. So if you could design the ultimate experiment to really put this idea to the test, what would that look like?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's something that researchers are actively working on right now, because if we're really going to crack this nut, we need to go beyond just noticing an effect. We need to understand the mechanisms behind it.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we move from, hey, this is weird, to, aha, now we're getting somewhere?
Well, for starters, we need to eliminate any lingering doubts about those random number generators themselves. Like, what if we use not just one type of RNG, but a whole bunch of them? Some based on computer algorithms, others on quantum mechanics, maybe even some that tap into natural phenomena like radioactive decay.
So it's like creating this, I don't know, symphony of randomness. Each instrument playing its own tune, but all contributing to the same overall effect.
Precisely. Because if we see the same effect across a variety of RNGs, it makes those alternative explanations, like hidden patterns or biases, a lot less likely.
Right, because at that point, it's like, okay, what are the odds that all these different methods of generating randomness are flawed in the exact same way?
Exactly. But it's not just about the technology. We also need to think about the human side of the equation. Like, who are the ideal participants for this kind of experiment? Are we looking for people who claim to have strong mental abilities, like experienced meditators, or do we want a more diverse group? And then there's the experimenter effect.
Right, because even with the best of intentions, if the experimenter knows what the desired outcome is, they might subtly influence the participants without even realizing it.
Exactly. So we need to get really creative with our experimental design. Double-blind procedures, where neither the experimenter nor the participant knows the target outcome until after the data is collected, are a must. But I think we can go even further. Instead of just looking at whether or not there's an effect, we need to get more granular. Does the effect change with distance? Does it matter if the person trying to influence the RNG is right next to it or miles away?
Ooh, interesting. What about things like time of day, electromagnetic fields, stuff like that? Could those have an impact?
Those are great questions. And what about the participant's emotional state? Does that play a role? By systematically manipulating these variables, by really getting our hands dirty with the experimental design, we can start to tease out the nuances of this potential mind-matter interaction.
It's like we're shifting from simply trying to find a needle in a haystack to actually mapping out the entire haystack, understanding its structure, its composition.
And who knows what we might find hidden within those haystacks? New technologies, new therapies, a whole new understanding of the nature of consciousness itself. It's a pretty exciting time to be exploring these big, mind-bending questions.
It really is. This whole deep dive has been quite a journey. We started with declassified CIA documents, and now we're talking about the potential for human consciousness to, like, reshape reality as we know it.
It's amazing, isn't it? The line between science fiction and cutting-edge science is getting blurrier all the time.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this field of research so captivating. It's a constant reminder that we're living in a universe filled with mysteries waiting to be unraveled, and who knows, maybe we hold the key to some of those mysteries within our own minds. To all our listeners, if this deep dive sparked any aha moments for you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Head over to our social media pages and join the conversation. And hey, maybe one of you will be the one to design that perfect experiment that finally unlocks the secrets of consciousness. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey into the deep